think about when you hear the names Adam and Eve? Do you think about man's rebellion and woman's natural gullibility? Do you think about the deceit of Satan and the goodness and grace of God? Do you think about original sin and man's need for atonement? If so, you were probably raised in a fundamentalist or fundy-light church. Like millions of people across the country, I was taught that the account of Adam and Eve as told in Genesis was a literal historical account of the first man and woman. It was the account of their rebellion against God and his punishment of their sin, and the introduction of original sin into the world that we live in. Before Adam and Eve sinned, the world was perfect. It was paradise. And it could have remained that way if Adam and Eve would have just obeyed his one command. But they couldn't do that. They thought that they were better than God, and because of it, they were cursed. And not only them, but all of their descendants as well, including you and me. And because of that, we are born into a world of sin with a sinful nature. And we must atone for that, but we can't do it on our own. We've got to call out to God. We've got to accept the sacrifice of Jesus. His blood has to cover us and wash us clean. We can be made pure. Our sin will be tossed away, and God will accept us into heaven, and we'll live with him forever. I think that about wraps it up, right? I have found it so helpful in my deconstruction journey to unpack the stories that I was taught growing up in the church and view them not through the lens of my pastor, not through the lens of my Sunday school lesson, but to read the text as it is and come to my own conclusion. I gotta say, how I see this story now is totally different than I saw it growing up in the church. And now that I'm on the other side, I don't know how I could have seen it any other way. I really do think that God is the bad guy, and I think I might be able to convince you of that too, but I'm gonna let you decide. Now keep in mind, I'm gonna be talking about this story as it's seen through a fundamentalist lens. This is a literal interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve, which in my opinion is the worst interpretation. I think that this is a symbolic, metaphorical story, perhaps a poem that expresses this relationship between God and mankind. I don't think that it has anything to do with the modern day literalist interpretation in the fundamentalist churches. So according to Genesis, God puts Adam in this beautiful garden. There's all these trees and plants that are good for eating, and he's allowed to eat from any tree he wants to, except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now I want you to think about that. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. That is the tree that God told Adam not to touch. Now we're just going to put on the back burner the fact that God even put a tree in Adam's midst and gave him the first temptation. But why is it that the tree of knowledge is the one that God does not want Adam to eat from? Why does God want Adam to be ignorant? Now God tells Adam that he has free reign over everything. The only tree he can't eat from is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For in the day that he eats of it, he will die. I find it interesting that a lot of modern English translations actually say, for when you eat of it, you will certainly die, almost to insist that death will happen eventually. But the original language actually uses the word yom, which means day. In the day that you eat of the fruit, you will die. You will surely die. And this is very interesting because as you see later on, when they eat from the tree, they don't die, at least not immediately, not that day. But we're going to get to that. So after this, God creates Eve from the rib of Adam. We all know the story. There's not much to say there. So the serpent walks up to the woman. Yes, walks, because he had little legs. And he says to the woman, "Did God really tell you that you couldn't eat from any tree in the garden?" And the woman responds to him and she says, "Well, God did say that we could eat from any tree except for one tree. He told us we shouldn't eat from it, otherwise we could die." And I think it's important to note that Eve never actually spoke directly to God. There's no text that shows God telling Eve the rules. He told Adam about the tree and his command not to eat from it before Eve was created. And so I feel like it would be safe to conclude that Eve didn't get her information directly from God, that Adam was the one that told Eve about God's rule about not eating from the tree. But before the fall, before Eve was cursed, she was not underneath Adam's authority. Eve was under no obligation to follow any rules given to her by Adam. And if God never actually relayed that rule to her himself, why do we think she was under any obligation to follow it? I mean, Eve didn't even have knowledge of good and evil. How did she know she wasn't being deceived by Adam? How did she know she wasn't being deceived by God? I think even in her ignorance, she wanted more. She had an inner knowledge, a knowing that she decided later on in the story, as we'll see, to follow. So during this exchange with Eve and the serpent, she tells the serpent that she's not allowed to eat from the tree of good and evil because she will die. And the serpent responds back to her and he goes, "You're not going to die if you eat from the tree. God just knows that if you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you will become like him, knowing good from evil." I think it's really important to pay attention to what the serpent is claiming. Is he really deceiving Eve? Eve then looks at the tree and she sees that it looks appealing, it looks like it's good for food, and it looks like it's good for gaining wisdom. And she decides to take a piece of fruit and eat from it. And I love the way this is worded because it doesn't show Eve as being deceived or gullible. It doesn't even show her as being rebellious or following the guidance of the serpent. It says that Eve looks at the tree herself, that she sees that it's good for gaining wisdom. She sees that it's good for food, and she decides to eat from it. She follows her own intuition, and she realizes that there's something about this tree that will give her what she wants. She won't have to live in this ignorance anymore. And I don't think she has malicious intent. I don't think she has rebellious intent. I think she just wants what the tree has to offer. And besides, if God didn't want her eating from it, why did he put it there? Why did he make it so appealing, so attractive? It says that the tree looked like it was good for food. It was obviously very appealing. If God didn't want them to eat from it, why didn't he make it unappealing? Why did he make it tempting? If anybody is deceiving here, it's God, not the serpent, because the serpent is just telling Eve, this is what will happen. But God is the one that put the tree to tempt her with it in the first place. And if he really truly didn't want her to eat from it, if he was worried about the consequences of eating from it, he should have just not put it there. So Eve eats from the tree, but it also says that she handed the fruit to her husband, who was standing there with her. And I think this is left out in so many sermons on this story, because I always thought that Eve was kind of off in the distance, meeting up with the serpent in secret and rebelling and bringing the fruit back to Adam in a basket or something, you know? But Adam was standing there with her the entire time. Silently, I guess. He wasn't saying a word. While her and the serpent were having this exchange, he's just like standing there like, you know, cross-armed, just like looking around going do-do-do-do-do. If Adam got the command directly from God, why didn't he stop Eve? If he knew how important this rule was, why didn't he say something to Eve when the serpent was deceiving her? And why did he just so readily eat from the tree when she gave him the fruit? He was his own person. He could have made his own choice, but he decided to take from the tree as well. Now look at this. After they ate from the tree, their eyes were opened. Where have we heard that before? The serpent told them, if you eat from it, your eyes will be opened. You're not going to die. They didn't die. Their eyes were open. They recognized that they were naked. They sewed some fig leaves together and made some loincloths, and they went hiding from God because they were embarrassed and ashamed. So here we are after they commit the big crime. They eat from the tree, and we find out that all along, God was lying when he said that they were going to die the day they ate from it. Now, you can say that this was a spiritual death, but the text doesn't say that. You have to add to the text to come to that conclusion. You can also say that they started dying that day, that they were immortal and God created them to live forever, but then the day they ate from it, they began to die. But that's not true either, because Adam and Eve were never immortal. They never ate from the tree of life, and the tree of life is what would give them eternal life. And so they didn't lose their immortality because they never had it in the first place. Now here is where it gets kind of creepy and a little reminiscent of like a horror movie, because God just starts like walking around in the garden and Adam and Eve can hear his footsteps and he's like calling out for them, like, where are you? Where are you? And I just can't help but to picture like a horror movie where, you know, the victims are hiding in the corners and it's dark and scary and the killer is walking around all slow, calling out for them and taunting them right before he slashes them to pieces. It's just really creepy and it feels very manipulative, especially because we already know God knows where they are. He already knows what they've done, but he's playing some kind of a game. And Adam finally calls out because he gets afraid. And he says, I heard the sound of you in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. And God responded and said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you not to eat? And the man said, the woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit and I ate. He throws Eve under the bus instantly. Adam was there the entire time and he's pretending to be completely ignorant of the situation, as if she got from some random tree and just gave it to him and he took it unknowingly. But no, Adam was there the entire time and God knew it and God saw it, and Adam is feeling really ashamed right now. So he instantly just throws Eve under the bus. Then God turns to Eve and he says, what have you done? Now note, this is the first time we see God speaking directly to Eve. He doesn't talk to her at all before this. The first time we see God talking to Eve is to chastise her for something that she's done. This story is rooted in the patriarchy, so I think we're going to see a lot of that seeping through the storyline. Eve responds to God and she's like, the serpent gave me the fruit and I ate from it. He tricked me. And so now she's throwing the serpent under the bus and the blame is just rolling downhill, and it starts from the top. And I'm not talking about Adam. I'm talking about God. The blame starts there. And I think that's where it should stay. But God rolls that blame downhill to Adam by saying, what have you done? Did you eat from the fruit? And then Adam's like, well, Eve told me to. And then he's like, what have you done? Did you eat the fruit? And she's like, well, the serpent told me to. And the serpent is blamed by everyone, when really the bad guy, the one who should be blamed, is God. He's the one that set all this up. He's the one that created these people imperfectly, with the ability to rebel against him, to think for themselves. He's the one that put the tree in the garden. He's the one that put Satan in the garden. He's the one that, with foreknowledge in his infinite wisdom, created this scenario and knew exactly how it was going to go down. And instead of choosing not to create the scenario, or perhaps having more patience and understanding because he knew the outcome, he decided to blame them for what they had done, to guilt them and to curse them and punish them for what he already knew they were going to do. It's a mess. And I think that that blame should have stayed right there, right at God. I mean, you have to think, Adam and Eve are these newly formed creations. They have no life experience. They have no knowledge of good and evil, which means no knowledge of right and wrong. They probably don't know very much. They have newly formed brains. How much can you possibly blame them? Because I feel like you'd be able to blame them as much as you'd be able to blame a toddler for doing something they're not supposed to do. And I would hope that if a toddler does something they're not supposed to do, their parent will be compassionate and understanding and will teach them a lesson rather than punishing them. But that's just not God's way. And God decides that cursing them and all of their descendants is the most appropriate response to Adam and Eve eating from this tree. God curses the serpent and makes him lose his legs. Now he's got to crawl on his belly and eat the dust from the ground and become the enemy of the woman. The woman now has to suffer painful, excruciating childbirth in order to multiply the earth. She is no longer equal with Adam, and now she has to serve him, and he is made to rule over her. And Adam now has to work the fields all the days of his life and by the sweat of his brow provide for his family. Now I think in all of this, the woman got the short end of the stick. She has to experience excruciating childbirth, raise her kids, and can we think of a time in history when women weren't also helping work the field? And I think her punishment is very unfair compared to the serpent and Adam. But that's just me. Notice in verse 22, after God curses Adam and Eve, it says, "The Lord God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil." The serpent did not lie. The serpent said that they would not die. They didn't. He said that their eyes would be open. Their eyes were open. And it said that they would become like God. And God admits it right here in verse 22. They have become like us, knowing good from evil. And you might be asking yourself, who is us? Who is God talking to when he says this? And as a fundamentalist, I believe that God was speaking to the members of the Trinity. So it was the Father God and Jesus the Son and the Holy Spirit. And God was talking to himself within the Trinity, saying that, man and woman have become like us. But I never really considered what this verse was conveying. They've become like us. What does that mean, to become like God? Of course, it does kind of expand on that. It says knowing good and evil, but to what extent? And why is it such a bad thing that Adam and Eve would know good from evil? I thought that we needed evil in order to understand good, but apparently we don't. We could just live in a world without evil. So that begs the question, Why did God create evil and suffering? Why does it exist? And a fundamentalist will tell you because, well, Adam and Eve introduced sin into the world. Now we live in a fallen world, but it didn't have to be that way. God didn't have to give them this tree, this temptation, this serpent. And you say, well, God had to because he wanted to give them free will. He wanted to give them the choice. Well, he could have given them free choice without giving them these temptations of these awful things that would create this fallen, cursed world. You don't have to put a knife in a playpen with a toddler in order to give them free choice of all of their toys. You can put blocks and a doll and little stacking rings, and you don't have to put a weapon in the playpen in order to allow that child to choose which toy they want to play from. Adam and Eve could have had free reign over the land, free choice of all the plants. God could have not put the serpent in the garden. He could have just snapped his fingers and rid him of his existence. But at the end of the day, we look at the text and we see God had choices, and he made his choices. He decided to tempt them. He decided to bring about all these temptations and then expected them to know better. Without having the knowledge of good and evil, without having the knowledge of right and wrong, he expected them to know better than to actually make a mistake. And a mistake is what they made. And I wouldn't even say that it was necessarily an intentional mistake. And I don't even think that Adam and Eve would have considered what they were doing to be an intentional mistake. I think that they felt like they were doing the right thing, and they were wrong. We've all been there. Do we deserve to be cursed along with all of our descendants for doing something that we don't really realize is so wrong? It really makes you wonder why God was so harsh on them in his punishment. Why God was so angry at them for doing the very thing that he created them to do in the first place. And why is he cursing the descendants of these people who committed this awful crime? That's one of the cruelest things you could do to someone, is to punish them for a crime that they did not commit. And yet fundamentalists and evangelicals will say that we are still paying the price for the sin committed by people thousands and thousands of years ago. If you're a young earth creationist, we believed that this all happened around 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, but we won't get into that today. But when you really break it down and you consider the punishment versus the crime and who suffers for that crime, it really seems unjust and unfair, which are two things God is not supposed to be. He's supposed to be perfect in his justice, and yet he has punished all of us for the sins of two people. Instead of giving us each our own individual opportunity to not be born into sin nature, to have our own choices and decisions, we are just naturally cursed. And when we sin, we are doing the very thing that God cursed us to do. We can't help it. It's God's fault. Again, the blame rests on God's shoulders, and yet nobody in the church wants to acknowledge that. They want to point the blame at us, saying, I'm the one that sinned. Well, if I'm sinning, it's because I was born into sin nature and I was cursed with sin nature by God. Therefore, I'm doing the very thing that God intended for me to do as a human being, as a creation. Yet I'm going to be punished for that. And I don't have to be punished for that as long as I accept the sacrifice of Jesus. And then you bring in, the atonement for the sin. And I'm just wondering, doesn't this seem very manipulative? For God to curse us with something that we must be punished for, that is out of our control, it doesn't really seem to fall into the category of free will, when we could not be any other way but sinful. And that is because the curse that God put on us. God drove them out of Eden. They were no longer allowed to live in paradise. He guarded the tree of life with a flaming sword. It was very dramatic. And they were never allowed to take and eat from the tree of life and live forever. They were never allowed to gain their immortality. When you really break this story down, and if you're looking at it through a literalist lens, and you're considering that these are just people, newly formed creations that really didn't know the implications of their actions, did the punishment fit the crime? Should they have been punished? Should they have been tempted in the first place? Were they ever really given free will? My takeaway from this story is God wants us ignorant. He doesn't want us to have knowledge. He doesn't want us to gain wisdom and have open eyes. He wants us to be blind and obedient. And I think that's a perfect representation of what the church wants out of its members. I think the church wants us to be blind and obedient, to not question anything, to not follow our intuition. They want us to block ourselves away from the knowledge around us and to just trust in whatever they're saying and follow it as truth, as divine. So I think this has been a very convenient story to maintain control over the masses, to make the case for original sin, for why all of us are flawed and in need of what the church has to offer, Jesus. And then if we don't accept that, we could face severe consequences that will last into eternity. That's a very convenient story to spin to someone when you're trying to get them to stay under your control, to be obedient to whatever you tell them. And I think that this literalist, fundamentalist view of this story has brought a lot of harm to a lot of people, and in some ways unintentionally. But I don't think that it's the way the story was intended to be told. I don't think that the modern day interpretation is anything like the ancient interpretation. This is a mythological representation of God's relationship with humanity, not some sort of lesson in obeying God or else. If you're looking at it through a literalist lens, you're seeing God as impatient, as uncompassionate, as unwilling to give second chances, as harsh and cruel in his punishment. And I think none of those qualities align with the narrative that the church is trying to spin on who God is as a father, as your caretaker, as someone who loves you and wants a relationship with you. And I think the story as it's told in the church compared to God as he's told in the church are two completely contrary ideas. And I hope that more people are willing to view stories like this not through the lens of their church upbringing, but to use critical thinking, to look at it from a rational perspective and realize that the way the church is spinning this has a purpose and it only benefits them. It doesn't benefit you. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed diving into this story. I know that I did. I always love talking about the story of Adam and Eve and what I take from it today versus what I used to take from it, because they're two completely different takes. I no longer see Eve as rebellious or easily deceived. I see her as strong and intuitive and willing to take what she wants. I see the serpent as being honest and open and an advocate for true free will. I see God as this controlling, manipulative, evil monster who is just kind of pulling all the strings for the puppets in his play and expecting them to stay in line, to not make mistakes, and if they do, to suffer serious consequences for that. But there's going to be a lot of people who disagree with me. There's going to be a lot of different interpretations and takeaways from the story and the text, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Even if you don't agree with me, share them in the comments. Let me know what you think. If you're on TikTok, give me a follow there, Christy.Burke. If you want to support me and join my book club, the link to my Patreon is in the description. If you have any ideas or thoughts for future videos, topics you'd like to see me cover, apologetics you'd want to see me respond to, leave a comment. Let me know. I would love your feedback, especially as I'm getting this channel up and running, trying to figure out what works, what you guys want to see, what you don't want to see. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your support, and I will see you next time.